Welcome, everyone. This is the World Leisure Organization's Leisure Management Special Interest Group's Leisure Management Webinar Series. The Leisure Management SIG, the Special Interest Group, was established several years ago, and this is just one of the initiatives that we do to try and service the needs of our industry across the board. So we're here today for the Crisis Preparedness webinar, a conversation with Patrick Hammer. So I will introduce now those people that you're likely to be able to see. So there's Joanne Zimmerman, who is co-chair of the Leisure Management SIG and also an associate professor at Texas State University. Antonio Bramante is the member of the World Leisure Board and works very closely with us in the Leisure Management SIG and is a key part of our team. I'll introduce a bit more about Patrick in a few minutes, but Patrick's our special guest today. And we also have Isabel and Maria, who are with the World Leisure Secretariat, who are helping us. I'm John Tower. I'm the co-chair of the Leisure Management Special Interest Group, and also I am an honorary fellow at Victoria University. Before we get started, it's a tradition in Australia to pay respect to the traditional owners of the land. I respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners of this land. I'm on Wurundjeri land in the Kulin Nation. I value the culture, relationships to country, kinship connections, and journeys of the first peoples of the land. I pay respect to the traditional elders, past, present, and emerging. I'd like to introduce Patrick Hammer as our special guest today. Patrick is the Director of Parks and Recreation in Erie, Colorado. He has a Bachelor of Science in Recreation Administration from the University of Northern Colorado and a Master's in Management and Strategic Business Development from Colorado State University. Patrick's also had his role with leisure organizations. He served as a board member and past president of the Colorado Parks and Recreation Association. So for those of you that are involved, we have a chat function where you can share comments or questions. So Joanne will be monitoring the English chat, and Bramante will monitor the Portuguese chat, and Bramante, with his multi-talents, will be able to translate any of those of you that choose to discuss things in Portuguese or hopefully Spanish as well. The format today is around a 20-minute conversation with Patrick, and then we'll be followed by your questions and comments. We should be done in around 45 minutes. So the aim of the webinar is to introduce some principles to guide leisure managers and researchers as they prepare for the unexpected, and to identify how our industry can respond when the crisis exceeds their expectations. Welcome, Patrick.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you here. So can you just tell us a little bit more about your background and how crisis preparedness became an issue for you? And I will share the screen now to just let people see where you're based. But please go ahead and start explaining yourself.
John, thank you. Thank you for the introduction, and thanks for the invitation. It's maybe not the best thing to have happen in your career, but throughout my career in Parks and Recreation, and thank you for showing the map. I am in Colorado, kind of right smack in the middle of the United States. We're a perfectly square state, kind of in the middle. We have the Rocky Mountains, which is probably our most noticeable feature. But I've been in Parks and Recreation since about 1999, 2000, and I had the unfortunate experience of early in my career being in a Parks and Recreation system very near to our first mass school shooting in the United States, which was the Columbine shooting. And as you can see by the graphic, throughout my time in Parks and Recreation and living in this area, have been exposed to a handful of crisis and disasters. You can see that in 2012, we had a large shooting at a movie theater. I was the Parks and Recreation director in 2013 in a municipality, and we faced 8 days of rain and almost took our entire annual amount of rainfall all in 1 week, and had to navigate a community and a parks and recreation system through what happens when your community gets flooded out. Colorado is actually a pretty dry climate, so dealing with floodwaters from a design perspective and an operating perspective is something that we were really pretty foreign to. The organization that I'm in now, when I started here, we had the misfortune of falling prey to a cyber crime and unfortunately lost over $1 million through a cyber attack. Shortly after that, in the same area, had another mass shooting, and then very, very recently, catastrophic urban wildfires that ripped through actually the same community that I was working in 2013 that suffered the flooding. And why I became so passionate about this is because I believe that as parks and rec and leisure practitioners, we're integral to communities bouncing back, and we're integral to communities helping process what happens when our gathering spaces face some type of disaster, crisis, or trauma. And I think that, and we'll get into this, I think, is when you can break down these focus points, you're better suited to navigate yourself and your community and your employees through it. So I wish that I didn't have this map, but I do. And I've been able to talk to a lot of colleagues in Colorado and learn a lot about how to navigate your parks, recreation, and leisure system through that.
Okay, well, it is an unfortunate list, and I guess, you know, it's unfortunately, I know in Australia here we're seeing more and more different crises. We've had significant floods. They had several once in a 1,000-year floods up north in Australia this year, and so these sorts of things are becoming more common, and so the need to be prepared for them is really important. So can you just start off by explaining a little bit what happens when a Parks and Recreation department is confronted by what may be an unexpected crisis?
Yeah, great. Excellent way to start the conversation. I think what is interesting is if you are responsible for a parks, rec, leisure operation, it is important that you define what a crisis or a disaster is, because admittedly, it means something different to everybody. What our first responders, our police, our firefighters, our emergency managers, what they may view as a crisis or a disaster may be something completely different than what we view that as in the world of parks, recreation, and leisure. So I think it's important to start there. And I think how we've defined that here in Erie, Colorado is if there is a single event or a series of events that disrupts our normal operations for about 24 to 48 hours, we want to make sure that we're prepared to navigate that. And it's been my experience as great practitioners and lovers of the community. We're the doers. We're the people that love to gather. We like to organize things. We like to provide safe spaces for people, that when these places and spaces and our people face hardships, I think it can be hard as a parks and recreation professional to realize we are not the first group that runs to the rescue. We get to play a support role. We have amazing police, firefighters, military personnel, rescue personnel who really do need to move into those places first. And I think what I've seen over the years is there's a little bit of heartache and then confusion and not knowing what to do, not knowing what our role is as community leaders to help the community navigate something. Most recently, a wildfire in Colorado, in an urban setting. So picture a neighborhood, over 1,000 houses burned to the ground in a very short amount of time. And I think our natural instinct is we want to be there to help. And I think that when we don't get to do that and we lose place of where we're supposed to be, it can be pretty frustrating and confusing and a little bit deflating for parks and recreation employees. And I think if you have a game plan and you know when it's appropriate for you and your team to step in, you can really provide a lot of meaning for your community.
Okay, well, let's talk about what are some of those strategies, and I'll go back to the slides again and share your slides. So what do? You talk about things before, during, and after. So guide us through some of these key points.
Yeah, absolutely. After a lot of dialogue, again, with professionals here in Colorado, myself personally having dealt with a handful of events, is a disaster or a crisis or an unexpected event can feel like this really big, overwhelming task that almost feels like it's too big to comprehend or too big to manage. And really, what it kind of boils down to is, if you, prior to an event happening, have a decent understanding of what's your operations look like financially. Are you an organization that has some reserve funds? How are you operating before this event financially? Do you have a good understanding of just your assets and infrastructure? And what I mean by that is, are you fully aware of what do you have in your common spaces? For us here, we have parks everywhere. We have gathering pavilions everywhere. Do you know what those assets and infrastructures are? Are you really sound in your operations? And are you really understanding your staff and your community? I like to, almost kind of call that your human capital. And if you have a good understanding of those kind of 4 pillars prior to an event, let's say a fire happens or a flood happens, you can actually say, okay, what's happening during an event to our financial system? What's happening to our assets and infrastructure? What are the impacts to our operations? What are the impacts to our staff? And what are our impacts to the community? And then you can do the same after an event. If you keep this kind of tight focus on these 4 areas, and you can deploy your people who are great professionals, who love to do this type of work, and say, okay, we've maybe had a flood. What is that going to do to us financially? Maybe when it's safe, we're going to go out and visit the community let's assess. Do we have bridges in our parks that have come down? Do we have unsafe gathering spaces? Let's say a building has burned down, or there's been loss of life and our operations are heavily impacted. And then all the while, what's happening to our community members? What's happening to our staff? I think if you can really kind of focus on these 4 pillars in a before, during, and after state, you can more quickly rebound and get your community back on their feet, and you as a organization can rebound quickly. If a crisis happens or an event happens and you say, oh my gosh, I don't even know what I'm responsible for, I think that there's probably a park over there, or I know that we had some employees, but I don't have their phone numbers. I don't know how to get a hold of them. You don't want to be doing that type of research in the middle of a crisis. So I think it really comes from understanding your basic operations really well in a before, during, and after scenario.
So can you give us a bit of an example? You mentioned the most recent thing was some wildfires and 1,000 homes got burnt to the ground and those sorts of things. What would be some of the specific examples for any of those points that you could share with us regarding the finance, the assets, the operations, or the people things?
Absolutely. I was fortunate enough to have some conversations with some colleagues who are near and dear to my heart, who suffered that fire firsthand. And what was interesting is everybody very quickly realized how reliant we are on our computers to put us in contact with other people. And what happens when you no longer have access to your emails, you no longer have access to your computer servers? Do you have, we used to, when I back first started, you had a printed sheet of paper with everybody's phone number on it. And you would say, okay, I'm going to call the first person is going to call the second person. We have actually navigated away from that basic communication. And with that, we pay most of our employees, we pay our bills, we run our operations largely using computer systems. What happens to your financial system if your servers have now burnt to the ground or have washed out in a flood situation, or you physically can't operate because you can't get to your office to get to your computer? And I think as great as technology is, when you become over reliant on that, when those assets are removed from you or those tools are removed from you, you're that much further behind trying to navigate your people in your community through a situation. And I remember having conversations with staff and just the anxiety and the consternation of not having access to your computer. We're a culture, at least here in the States, where we're glued to our phones, we're glued to our laptops, we're glued to our emails. Well, in a disaster, you may not have that. And you need to be prepared to operate without those tools. And I think it's important that we understand that that's a reality. Even with COVID in a pandemic where people had to quarantine and stay away, do you have the tools with you to be effective? And I think some lessons have been learned recently about that.
Okay, so what happens when those things occur? So have you had circumstances in your experience where the event exceeds your plans and your systems are in failure? What do you do? How do you respond in those circumstances?
Absolutely, a great, and I'll never forget this. In 2013, I was a recreation manager, and we had just hosted our largest community event. We had, between 8 and 10,000 people out for a big festival in the park, and we were cleaning up from the festival, and it started to rain, and it rained for 8 days. And I remember by the time we realized that we were on the precipice of a major flood event, we couldn't access our equipment. We couldn't even successfully help people kind of navigate, because by the time we realized that we were in this crisis mode, floodwaters had started to separate us from the tools we needed to get the job done. Same thing in terms of communication. Storms have a tendency to knock out just basic communication tools. The amount of time and energy wasted trying to just get a hold of each other and then kind of create a plan, it so far exceeded anything that we were prepared for. We basically had to kind of sit and wait. We were at the discretion of those systems coming all the way back up online before we felt like we can effectively manage this situation. And then what happens, I think, from a public's perspective, as they're also wanting help and seeking help, when as leaders we're idle because we can't effectively do our job, the frustration level increases. And it's hard. It's emotionally hard for us as employees, and I think it's really hard on our community members. And it was so vivid to me, literally standing watching water flow past, and the tools that I needed, the equipment that we needed to help move people, I could see it. On a normal day, it would take me 20 seconds to walk to it, and there wasn't actually all that reasonable of a way for me to get to it. And we were drastically underprepared for that situation.
Okay, so we've talked along the way about our park and recreation departments are not first responders. We've got emergency services staff, ambulances, fire, police, and those sorts of things that sort of step up when the crisis strikes. But how can our parks and recreation departments support the first responders?
We can do what we do best, which is we care for people, I think, better than any other professionals. I really do believe that. I've seen the most amazing, compassionate logistical planning come from parks and recreation professionals. We're the type of people in the community that if you give us a little bit of a challenge and say, hey, we need to have a gathering of several thousand people in a park in a week, we're going to pull it off. I think what we can do in those situations is we can embrace our role of taking care of those people who do need to go to the front line. I think we can understand that they too need a network. They too will have needs to keep them going. I think it is interesting throughout kind of my career, there does seem to be a 2 to 3 week window, sometimes longer, where you do have emergency personnel in your systems needing to do the type of work that they do. And I think the best thing we can do is we can be there for them. We can be attentive to their needs. We can remove obstacles and barriers. We can provide things like making sure that they have access to equipment, we don't need to be right there with them. As parks and recreation professionals, we're not trained for that. I think our hearts tend to want to go there. I think those first couple of weeks, we really need to understand that our role is to care for those who are going to move to the front lines first, and be really, really, really attentive to starting to pick up on what our community members need as they are also going through this, this crisis, this situation, this natural disaster. I think the worst thing that we can do is let our good intentions to be at the front lines start to occupy us where we get in the way of the actual immediate work that needs to be done.
Okay. Well, I know in Australia, we've recently had some terrible floods, and it's not unusual where they're still standing that the community leisure recreation centers are a place of refuge for people escaping fires or floods. And one of the things that I heard one of the commentators say is that you've got people working in the leisure center that are dealing with individuals that have just lost everything, very serious, traumatized. And one of the comments was these recreation center staff were not trained or prepared as to how to deal with the trauma, and the social workers and the others weren't going to arrive for several days. How do you prepare your staff to cope with those sorts of things?
Yeah, and we very similar here. Here in Erie, Colorado, we partner with the Red Cross. We have plans in advance. We communicate in advance. The building has supplies. We know how to mobilize those supplies in terms of let's say it's cots or getting access to food and water. And really, if that system works, we provide kind of the infrastructure backbone, and then hopefully those trained professionals can kind of come in. I think you bring up a really interesting point, is what happens when there's a little bit of a delay. I think the most important thing that we can do, in addition to providing, making sure that your building can handle that, I think is step number one. And as I mentioned, we have plans in place that can be implemented very quickly. Colorado's an interesting climate. We kind of get to see everything from obviously fires. We'll also get a lot of snow. I would say more frequently where I'm at in Erie, Colorado, we get called on to say, hey, if people can't navigate the roads, we're going to go ahead and have them come to the community center. The staff is prepared to mobilize the facility to do that. And then in terms of providing, I guess, the psychological care or the companionship, we've just talked as a staff of just keep it simple. Just be there. Lots of listening. If you can accommodate, if somebody needs something, by all means. But at the same time, I think it's important that as staff, we realize that we're not always trained to do that. We do need to kind of stay within the realm of what we're comfortable doing. And you can accomplish so much by just being an empathetic ear, simply helping somebody get set up if they're displaced. And those are the roles that we fill here, and that the staff would fill here in Erie if that situation was to come up. But I would encourage everybody, if you have a facility, work with your local, whether it's a police department or a fire department or emergency services, to understand how you can best take your space and how your space can be used. Because it's starting to become a little bit of a situation of not if, but when. And if you don't have that plan, you don't want to start it 2 days too late, 5 days too late. You need to have these plans in place prior to.
Okay, so one of the other aspects of the leisure management SIG is the leisure management research. Have you come across any research that sort of helps guide what happens in these settings and whatnot? Or if not, what sort of research do you think would be useful to get for the practitioners that are managing in these circumstances?
Yeah, no, John, I could say that I don't know that I've seen a lot of active research. What I can say is I think there's a lot of opportunities for emerging research on a couple of different levels. I think what we're starting to see here is even making sure that, say, a community center is designed with a dual purpose? Could you design a gathering space that could be used when everything's great? And can you also design that space to be used when everything is not great? Are we designing landscaping that looks really good, that also helps us with things like flood mitigation and fire mitigation? So I think from a design perspective or a programmatic, where you're thinking about how to use your spaces, it's really important. I think that there's probably a gap in that type of thought process. The other thing that I think is becoming a bigger deal, or as big of a deal, is this idea of the longer that our parks and recreation systems are offline, or our leisure services are offline, there is a cost to that. And if you're really, really unprepared for something, the amount of money and time that you're going to have to spend to get these services back up and running is significant. And I think that if you wanted to, that can be quantified. And I think a lot of times in our profession, what tends to hit home for people, especially high-level decision makers, is when you can boil those things down to a cost. Here in Erie, Colorado, we do make a decent amount of money off of our recreation programs. If, let's say, another pandemic hits and we shut down our operations for 6 months, there is a hit financially to our system. There's a cost to that. And then there's a cost to ramping those services back up. And I think that we need to start thinking about how to quantify those and articulate those. So yes,
Okay.
Do I see a ton of it? No. Do I think that as everybody starts to deal with different pandemics and disasters, I think that there's a great need to start to quantify and qualify the impacts. Absolutely.
Okay, so I think, we're now at the point where maybe we should see if any people have questions. I know Joanne and Vermonte have probably thought of a few things along the way. So maybe we can open it up to a bit more of a conversation with those that are here with us. Joanne, I think you're on mute.
Yes, I was going to say to the other two people, if you want to turn on your cameras and join in the conversation, that would be great. I know I had a question as a faculty member. What can I do to help prepare students who are moving into the field and will probably have to deal with some of these things?
Joanne, I love that. And I love that you brought that up. Do I think that we need to make crisis preparedness our #1 priority all the time? I don't. Do I think that we need to be aware of it? And do I think that we need to understand a basic skill set to navigate through, much like we would if we were teaching young professionals how to put together, let's say, a sports program or run an aquatic center? There are very simple logistical steps that we do seem to teach. I think that that's applicable here. We spend a lot of time in this profession making sure that we have every detail figured out to run these amazing community programs. I think it is time that we start to recognize that we need to have the details ironed out when things don't go well. And I do think that, do we need to scare people? Do we need to constantly focus on it? No, I don't. Does it need to be something that we plan for and prepare for? Absolutely. And if we need it, unfortunately, you can implement it, and you can implement it quick, and we can get back on our feet and serve our community, which is ultimately what we do best.
Thank you.
Patrick, I have several questions, but I think you covered most of them. So thank you very much first for your presentation. But how do you work in a synergy in your community, in a practical way? And I thought it was interesting you present a schematic type of the 4 pillars: before, during, and after. So if you consider this system, how do you work with your community of those who are in charge of security and previously to the event and right after the event, and if your facilities can become also a place where people can stay there for a while until they go to their homes?
Yeah, I think the most important thing that we can do is have open and honest conversations across our peer group. So for me, that would be police chief, finance director, the overall town administrator, really defining what your role is. I've seen this time and time again. I'm the director of a Parks and Recreation group. I've got about 50 full-time employees. We have about 250 part-time employees. My role during a disaster or a crisis will be to move actually out of my role as a Parks and Rec director, and I will join the leadership team. My employees need to understand what their roles are to make sure that our function as a Parks and Recreation department can carry on. And that won't happen unless we have the conversations in advance. If all of a sudden there's a fire and I'm picking up the phone and I'm trying to tell everybody what to do, well, that's actually our police chief's job, what to do. I need to understand that in that type of situation, I'm taking direction from her because that's my role. And what I see, and I've experienced this, is when that doesn't happen, you get a lot of voices talking at once. There's a lot of confusion at once. So Beramonte, it's a great question because it goes back to that basic communication principle is, who are the most qualified when and the timing? And then for me, and I would encourage anybody who's got both kind of a facility side, maybe a program side, we all have staff who are the most amazing, compassionate people who run great and they're with the public all the time. We may have some employees that love to do computer work and their skill set's really more in terms of budget or logistics. Prior to that happening, we need to say, okay, your skill set is really to be out there listening to the community. I've got some amazing employees that maintain our parks who I would say, I need you when it's safe. I need you to go do an assessment. Can you tell me what has happened to the community and report that back? I would not have my people who are going to hop in a truck and go look at the infrastructure be the exact same people who are going to go out and compassionately take care of the community. Nor would I take my recreation programming staff and put them in a situation of saying, okay, I need to go do a full conditions assessment and understand the physical impacts. And those have to be defined prior to a crisis. You don't want to start to have the conversation in the middle of it.
So, Patrick.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. We have a question from Easton. I'm not sure if I'm saying the name right, from Turkey. And they say in Turkey, we have lots of earthquakes. Parks and recreation areas become overpopulated gathering areas. People live there for many days. I noticed from Mr. Tower's question that we do not have research on that issue. Your experience is very important for research in the recreation management field.
Absolutely. You know, something that we've struggled with here is just the basic sanitation. When you do have people in your space for a prolonged amount of time, and remember, these spaces aren't designed to have that number of people for that long. What does that do to your sanitary system? What does that do to your water infrastructure? Basic things like the logistics of equitably handing out food and water. Imagine you've got a community whose water is now shut off. You can't just throw out the pallets full of water. You'll have an inequitable system of making sure your community is taken care of. And I love that point because I do think we need to start thinking about the dual purpose of our space. Let's say we have a soccer pitch. Yes, it can be designed as a soccer pitch, but you may need to realize that that soccer pitch could serve this other purpose. Absolutely.
Okay, have we got any other comments or questions? Well, thank you, everybody. So the webinar has been recorded. We'll let the registered participants know when the YouTube is available. Should be within a week, if not sooner. And I would encourage anyone and everyone to share the link with your colleagues who may be interested so that they can see it via the YouTube. We do have a capacity to, hang on, I need to go back to share screen. Where have I gone? We do have a capacity to let people ask questions if they're interested so that they can contact Patrick. I've got his email contact and the website for Erie, Colorado. There's Joanne and I in the Leisure Management Special Interest Group, and the World Leisure Organization Secretariat details are provided for you. I want to thank those of you that have joined us, and special thanks to Maria and Isabel and the World Leisure Secretariat. Very late at night for you, so thank you for joining us. And Joanne and Bramante for their ongoing collaboration with amongst our team to help deliver these leisure management SIG activities. Special thanks to Patrick, your willingness to share your insights about crisis preparedness. It's wonderful to have colleagues like you who are willing to contribute your expertise to help meet the World Leisure's mission of sharing leisure's capacity as a central force to enhance the human condition. So thank you, everybody. It's been great to be able to explore this. It's unfortunate that we live in a world where these sorts of things are more common, but I think that, you know, we also have an incredibly professional industry, and we've actually identified a number of research challenges for us so that we can do all of these things better. So thank you for everyone. And that will conclude our webinar for today. Goodbye.